There is a story on the this morning on the AP Newswire, and I happened to be looking at it a couple of minutes ago. Yesterday, there was a vote among Idaho state legislators. These were, I believe, in the House. It still has to be worked through the whole legislature and then on to the governor. A court had decided that Idaho's prohibition. There were women who were going into health clinics, and there was a doctor sitting hundreds of miles away, and the doctor would push a button and a pill would be dispensed, and the woman would grab it and gulp it down, and then she would spontaneously have an abortion within the next 24 hours. Now, this is anathema to a great many legislators in Idaho because it just runs counter to the beliefs they have about the sacredness of human life. So in Idaho, women were not allowed to go in and have a doctor who was sitting in Portland do that. But a court came along and said, well, you're interfering with their reproductive health, as if somehow being pregnant is an illness. And the court said you can't do this. So in Idaho, you actually have legislators who have to go against their conscience and vote to repeal this law. And they had to do it yesterday. And it mentions in the AP story, some of them were in tears having to do this. But it never mentions that they did it because of the court order. Now, AP would argue, we have space limitations. We can't mention all of this. But you can make some inferences by what they did mention and what they omitted, because at some point you could perhaps pull out another sentence about the tears on the floor of the House and at least let people know that they had no choice in this matter, because otherwise the state was going to be facing, for lack of a better series of words, a charge of contempt. So they had to do this for that reason, or the state was going to face huge fines once more, and you're going to have people screaming about that. Oh, here they go again. They shouldn't have any principles, and then they wouldn't have to pay any fines. That's the liberal view. Bill Colley with you on Top Story this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, 8 minutes after 8 o'clock. Speaking of abortion, Paul Ryan was appearing on TV yesterday. I happened to catch it live. He's the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, and he was explaining why we all need to get on board as Republicans and conservatives with Obamacare Light, as it's now being called, some people calling it Ryan Care. And one of the reasons he said was because it defunds Planned Parenthood. Here's the thing. Planned Parenthood gets a small portion of a budget every year that is directed towards abortions. That nitwit Chuck Schumer said earlier this week that Planned Parenthood, this is a terrible thing because they won't be able to conduct any more mammograms, even though Cecile Richards, the director of Planned Parenthood on the national level, has come right out and stated in front of a congressional committee that they don't do mammograms there. Sorry, Chucky. On the other hand, 1 of every 8 abortions performed in this country, it's 1 of every 8 women who walks into one of these clinics is getting an abortion. 1 of every 8 women going in the door and coming back out is going for that reason. That accounts for 1/3 of every baby killed in this country each year. So when he says that, you're sitting there, you're thinking, oh, gosh, gee willikers, Mr. Speaker Ryan, that's wonderful. I'm glad you informed us. Now I can get behind Obamacare Light. What he failed to say, and this is a little bit like being the Associated Press, he omitted something. And that is that the ban on funding Planned Parenthood will only last 1 year. So a year from now, Planned Parenthood will once again be getting your tax dollars in order to kill little babies in the womb. Thank you, Mr. Ryan, for not making that clear. We've got more on this subject. Speaking of which, Rand Paul was appearing on MSDNC's Morning Joe. He is a U.S. Senator from Kentucky, one-time presidential candidate, as was his father on a number of occasions. Rand Paul was speaking about his opposition to the Ryan Care plan. Take a listen for a moment. I think it's quite instructional.
Well, our plan is different. The House plan is Obamacare Light, keeps subsidies, keeps taxes, actually keeps an individual mandate, and bails out the insurance companies. My plan would realize freedom and competition. We would get rid of all the mandates so inexpensive insurance can be sold. We would allow health savings accounts to expand. Every Republican agrees with that. And we do something that nobody else is talking about in any of these bills. We let individuals join a group or join an association to get cheaper price and guaranteed issue through the marketplace, not through a mandate. One of the things that people are not talking enough about is every insurance executive told us if you keep guaranteed issue without the individual mandate, they will continue to hemorrhage hundreds of millions of dollars. That's why the House Leadership Plan has an insurance company bailout built into it, because it doesn't work. You can't have guaranteed issue and no individual mandate. That's why Obamacare put it in there. So what you have to have is a plan like ours that gets more people into group insurance and allows them to get guaranteed issue by getting group insurance and fleeing the individual marketplace.
So what do you on the Medicaid issue? Obviously, a number of Republican senators came out yesterday, said they couldn't support the current bill because it's not generous enough when it comes to Medicaid. What does your bill do in that area?
We don't address the Medicaid expansion or contraction in the replacement bill. We think that should be addressed in the repeal bill. And that's the real point that I told the president when I talked to him on the phone, and we said in our press conference yesterday, is the Republicans are in agreement on repeal, but we're not in agreement on replacement.
Now, I've got to point out, you've got Democrats who are now trying to call it Trump Care, but it is Paul Ryan's bill. And Mr. Trump has been saying the last few days that he's open to suggestions, changes. So he's keeping an open mind about all of this. He also understands there's tremendous opposition in the Senate and even over in the House. Rand Paul has a longtime political ally from Idaho by the name of Raul Labrador, and Labrador is leading the charge in the House to stamp out Ryan Care. He and a handful of others in the Freedom Caucus, and they have enough votes where they can stymie it if the Democrats don't vote for it. All through this procedure, can I tell you, we've had 7 years for Republicans to come up with some alternative. 7 years, an alternative plan. As it turns out, Rand Paul has been suggesting one, and he gave you some details. He's been suggesting it for years. Meanwhile, Paul Ryan and his fellow Republicans over in the House, and a great many Republican senators as well, talked a good game about repeal all these years, but they didn't have any backup plan. Do I think the government should even be involved? That's a good question. But if it's going to be, it needs to create a system where it just gets out of the way and allows the free market to take over, which I think is what Mr. Paul is talking about. But for 7 years, they said, aha, we're going to, if you ever give us the reins of power, we're going to get rid of Obamacare. And then when they actually got the reins of power with both houses of Congress and a president, they didn't have anything in place. So they had to throw this together in the last few weeks. Why didn't they have anything in place? Dr. Charles Krauthammer, who has been writing about this issue for years in his newspaper column, his syndicated column, and also he talks about it on television frequently, has said the reason is, and this is very simple, if this happens, media will come in. If you cancel Obamacare, you know what's going to happen? The propaganda wing of the Democrat Party, that's the mainstream media, is going to come on TV every night and say, Mary Jones has had 15 children by 10 drug-dealing men. Those men now are all in prison, and Mary Jones is unable to get the right health care she needs for her children. They've been sitting around drinking large soda pops and eating Doritos every night, and now they've all developed diabetes before the age of 10. The Republican Party is turning a deaf ear to Mary Jones and her 15 children from 10 different drug dealers who are now in prison. The Republicans obviously are mean-spirited. Never mind that Mary couldn't keep her pants on. Never mind she had poor choices in men. Never mind she didn't bother to finish school. It's going to be the Republicans' fault. This is how that's going to work. And they're going to try to tug at your heartstrings. They're going to show her children sitting around the house going, ha, 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 ha. Mary doesn't even have enough money to feed these children any longer, other than what the government sends her in a check every month, which comes from all of you. Oh, we weren't supposed to say that here in mainstream media. Krauthammer has said that this is a no-win situation for Republicans, that they had to come up with something, at least for the time being, and he's letting Ryan off the hook here. They had to come up with something for the time being because of what media was going to do to them if they just let Obamacare die, or they removed it and they, quote, didn't have a replacement plan, unquote, in place. So this is Krauthammer speaking about this issue, speaking on Fox News Channel last night.
I think Rand Paul is right. This is, in a sense, Obamacare light. I'm willing to admit it. Paul Ryan isn't. the others aren't. But in fact, the fact is history has moved since 2010. You know, the Republicans denounced the New Deal for 20 years. Eisenhower comes into office in 1953, and they don't touch an element of it. Social Security remains intact. They were not suicidal, and they live to govern another day. You cannot retract an entitlement once it's been granted. That's the genius of the left. There is no country in the West that has developed national health insurance and then revoked it.
Over at the Wall Street Journal, Review and Outlook, which is the lead editorial today in that newspaper, headline is this: what are the GOP alternatives? And the writer says the Democrats' position of obstruction is simple and purely political, oppose everything to add to the pressure on Republicans and hope the bill fails. And then the Democrats believe it will fail because it's really just Obamacare. They changed the name from Affordable Care Act to American Health Care Act and said, see, it's a new plan. It'd be like someone selling you a jalopy. You knew it was a jalopy when it was painted blue, and then they painted it yellow, and then they say, see, it's a different car. Page 2 of this editorial from the Wall Street Journal. Nearly a third of U.S. counties are now served by merely a single insurer. It could fall to zero. Republicans would own every horror story about cancer patients losing coverage and the poor thrown off the Medicaid rolls. Democrats suffered politically when Obamacare caused a wave of insurance cancellations in 2013. They're backing up what I told you. Mainstream media, working in collusion with the Democrat Party, will blame the Republicans no matter what happens. Ryan appearing last night with Tucker Carlson on the Fox News channel, maybe not quite saying it in that plain spoken manner, but pretty much saying the same thing.
A lot of outside groups and folks just don't understand the fact that if we put everything in the bill we possibly want, we would have a filibuster. We wouldn't be able to pass it in the Senate. So this bill, which is the first phase of a three-phase plan, is what we can pass without a filibuster in a budget bill. There are things like interstate shopping on health care, association of health plans to let people bulk buy their health insurance nationwide through buying pools, medical liability reform, all those things we very much believe in, which is part of our Better Way agenda. You cannot put in a budget bill because then they can filibuster that entire bill.
I understand, and tort reform and lots of other things. And I don't want to keep pressing you on this because you know as well as I. But these are members of Congress, so they know that. They know what a reconciliation bill is.
Well, we're finding that some don't. So what we're having here is we're passing this first installment, which is to gut Obamacare, repeal the mandates, repeal the taxes, repeal the spending. Then we replace it with conservative Republican tax policy that has been long-standing conservative reform. Health savings accounts, tax credits go by what you want to buy in state-regulated marketplaces, not federal, and risk pools. This is something that conservatives through the Heritage Foundation, through AEI, have been pushing for years.
So what you got here is an attempt, at least for a moment, they're just putting a finger in the dike as it's leaking. And they hope to come back and come up with something again on another day. Short break ahead. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. A few words with Attorney General Lawrence Wasden on the way later this show. To give you an insight into the perfidious nature of mainstream media, I've got a clipping here I'll share with you in just a moment. But first, I wanted to tell you about our friends at Western Visions, Inc. And I've been mentioning, I've had a close-up look at some of the renovation work that this company does. Western Visions, Inc. does high-end renovations. They're restoring a very historic building in Cassia County right now. In fact, one of the rooms in the building is the oldest freestanding room in that county, and that somebody had expanded onto the old farmhouse, but now it's going to become a private lodge. And they'll utilize layout and floor plan creativity. They were putting in some big beams the day I was over there. Next generation lighting schemes, that would be LED, which saves you a lot of money going forward. Project components and design element selections, Western Visions concepts crush the average and place your project at the forefront of your community's renovation curve. Western Visions works with you, hand in hand, from first concept through the design build process to completion. In other words, you're not going to be left out once you actually hire them. Western Visions, Inc. will be there with you and consulting you entirely. You'll be able to check in every day if you like and take a look at the work. If you'd like to know more, go to the website, western-visions.com. That's western-visions.com. 1310.com and have a look-see. Those of us who dream of these beautiful old historic houses, when you get to see something like that and actually the work going on, it just, I'd love to be able to look at it in a time-lapse photography and see, and maybe it's available. I'll have to talk to Russell about that one of these days and see when the job is finished soon, if we can get a close look at that. I may even be able to post that on our website as well, newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley with you this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX on Top Story, and I thank you for spending some time with us. We're at 45 already. Gosh, the weather forecast gets better and better as we head into this weekend and next week. A string of temperatures, according to one forecast I looked at this morning, day after day after day of 60 and above. Been a long time. Been a very long time. I just wanted to mention our check of the weather is brought to you by Mountain Home Auto Ranch. Whether they like it or not, I'm going to tell you it's a candy store for adults. Those of you who like automobiles, that's exactly what it is. I have a story that I pulled down from the resurgent Eric Erickson's website. The writer is named Gabriella Hoffman, and there's a new book out about the infamous abortion doctor, Kermit Gosnell. Now, this guy was running abortion clinics in 2 states. His main clinic happened to be in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Again, this is called healthcare by the American left. We now know that he was aborting babies who were nearly full term, and he was snapping their necks or cutting through their necks in order to kill them. He was he was chopping the feet off the little babies and putting them in pickle jars and putting them on shelves in his office, I guess for his own amusement and entertainment. And this went on for decades, under the watch of a so-called Republican governor named Tom Ridge, who blocked efforts in his state to crack down on abortion providers and provide more safety for women who were going to these clinics. This writer is detailing the new movie that's coming out. There's a movie and a companion book about Gosnell's House of Evils, his House of Horrors. The writer's name is McElhaney. Her husband's name is McAleer. They released a book in late January to accompany their film Gosnell, which Hollywood has rejected despite it having a $2.3 million budget. The abortion lobby is super entrenched in Hollywood. Even worse, the book was denied a mention on the New York Times bestseller list despite nearly outselling all copies. They are terrified that the gruesome nature of abortion won't be shielded anymore. I have to note that when his trial was going on, it should have been national news. But the mainstream media, the big news networks, I guess other than Fox, the Alphabet Networks, CNN, and MSDNC all avoided covering the trial. You could not have dragged them there to do it. They would have fought you every inch. The New York Times and the Washington Post were ignoring it. Those newspapers were questioned about why, and some editor at one of the papers said, well, it's a local news story in Philadelphia. We don't do those. Huh? In other words, we don't want to have to cover a story that would reflect poorly on the abortion mills. So we're going to claim it's a local story, even though this is likely going on all across the country. Had it been a House of Horrors that was being run, I don't know, let's say they had been a church had been kidnapping pregnant women off the street and holding them and feeding and clothing them until they actually gave birth to their children. National media would have said, Christians kidnapping young women against their will and making them have their children. When are they going to go to jail? We'd like to know. But in this case, since abortion is a liberal sacrament, along with smoking the ganja, they couldn't be bothered to cover the story. I have to tell you, it's a mirror into the soul of liberalism in this country and the fellow travelers in media. And maybe we have to even just stop saying, when we say DNC for Democrat National Committee or Democrat or liberal in mainstream media, we mean the same thing, don't we? So why should we even have to bother with an explanation at this point? We mean the same thing. We know who these people are. We know what they're like. There was a newspaper editorial I read the other day that was bad-mouthing. I told you the other day that the AP says that there's a handful of legislators serving in Boise who it defines as, according to the AP, not even as an editorial, but it was a news story, as far right. And I said, well, I challenged them, define far right. What does that mean? So the other day I saw a newspaper editorial, and it was in defense of Idaho House Speaker Scott Bedke, and rightly so. He was accused by a woman who might not be too stable of using bad language, sexually explicit language and the like, and she has a history of what could best be described as mental troubles. The story got picked up by a publication in northern Idaho, which decidedly is right of center and would admit it, and got promoted as if, in other words, just to give Bedke a hard time. I know from people I've talked to that even those so-called far-right legislators were outraged by what they saw, alarmed by it, and they wanted no part of that accusation. And yet, the writer of this newspaper editorial the other day said, if this is what conservatism is all about, then we want nothing to do with it. Two things that I gather from that. Number one, that's a tacit admission then that you're a liberal and that you don't want anything to do with conservatives because you're so far left you're falling over to the left side. And number two, you've just claimed that that publication is one and the same with half a dozen state legislators. But I don't know that they're on the payroll of that publication, nor are the writers of that publication on the payroll of those legislators. So if you get angry when I infer that you're just nothing but a propaganda wing for the Democrat Party, then obviously you've admitted it in that editorial. And number two, you make the same claim about the other side now, don't you? Coming up on 8:30, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Remember, next Wednesday morning, we're going to be joined by one of the medical pros from Tripp Family Medicine here in Twin Falls. And we'll be taking some of your telephone calls, too, as well, about medical issues. Dr. Tripp's office is still looking for new patients and often can see patients on the very same day. That's always a good thing. On the very same day. And the office is located on Fillmore Street in Twin Falls, directly across from the main post office. It's 44, and it's 8:30.